saying good morning to everyone, and then also a special hello and welcome to the good folks at Grand Lake Gardens, who I believe are joining us today for the first time. Do I have that correct?
Right. Yes, you do.
Yes, okay, good. So it's good to have another community joining us today. And I just want to be clear because you're joining us in the middle of a lecture series that has been going on for quite some time now. And of course, as is sometimes the case, you're joining us perhaps at the most difficult moment in terms of just the nature of the material we're covering. This week and the last couple of weeks might be the most abstract, philosophical of the material that we're recovering, that we're covering together. And so I'm going to start today, and I hope the good folks at Piedmont Gardens can bear with me by reviewing briefly some of the material that we've already covered together. And that way, I hope you will, those who are joining us just beginning today, have a sense of the territory that we've covered together and how it is that we ended up thinking about a bunch of philosophical issues together. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my slides, and I'm just going to point out and tell me the slides are now sharing, correct? There we go. Okay, good. We're in the middle of a lecture series on rising inequality.
Yes.
And what we've been looking at is the fact that the United States over roughly the last 50 years has become a considerably more unequal society. And we've surveyed some evidence for this proposition. And so right now, what I'm going to do is offer a brief overview of some of the themes covered so far in this class. I have some new data, some new way of at least diagramming this material. So this is not entirely redundant for those who have been with me for a while now. This is some evidence that the United States has become much more unequal. So we can start with the distribution of wealth and compare 1989 to 2016. If we went back to the 1970s, we would see even more of a difference. But what we see is that in 1989, the top 10% of Americans controlled 67% of the wealth. 2016, the most recent data we have, that same 10% controls 77% of the wealth. So up from around 2/3 to a little bit over 3/4. The share of wealth of the next 40%, you might think of this as the middle class to upper middle class, used to control 30%. Now they control 22%. And whereas in 2016, the bottom 50% of society, right, the lower half of society had 3% of the wealth that Americans owned. In 2016, it's down to 1%. So that's a remarkable decline. And please note that about 10% of Americans have negative net worth, no wealth, but in fact, debt that overwhelms their wealth. And so that's one respect in which we become more unequal. Very quickly, another respect in which we become more unequal is income. And I'll go a little bit more into this. I just want to start out on this idea. If you look at how much of the income generated in this country in 2016, the top 1% got, it's nearly 20% of overall income went to the top 1%. If you look at how much the bottom 50% got, it's less than 13%. So just to be clear, right, the top 1% in America earned more in 2016, got more income than the bottom 50%, which contains obviously 50 times more people, earned not just a little bit more, almost twice as much. Now, please note, if we compare ourselves with Germany, Britain, and France, things are the opposite, right, for them. The bottom 50% in Germany earns about 19% of the income in the country. In Britain, it's over 20%. In France, it's over 22%. And the top 1% earns far less. Not that they don't earn a lot, right? They earn around 11 to 13% in those three European societies. So the US is far more unequal than most developed societies are, and we've become that way. We were not always that way. So again, this is a diagram that's familiar to some of you. If we compare income inequality in the 1960s and 1970s, it's really not very extreme. We are quite packed together the way perhaps Britain and France and Germany are still today. And then you compare us with 2015, and we've become an extraordinarily unequal society, right? And the reason this has happened, the way this has happened, is because of the increase in the earning power of the top 0.01%, the top 1%, and the top 10%, and the stagnation or decline in income of the middle 40% and the bottom 50%. So that's the first big topic that we covered in this class, and we spent several weeks looking at the nature of inequality in America today. And by the way, part of the reason that we launched on this lecture series now is because during the coronavirus pandemic, the pandemic is, as I've put it, spreading in the fault lines that inequality has opened in our societies. It is affecting those who are poor, those who are economically precarious, those who are Black and brown, much worse than it's affecting the rest of us, in part because of the nature of the work that they do, in part because of the limited savings that they have, in part because of the inferior or non-existent access to healthcare that they have as well, right? And so this, it seems to me, is a particularly important and opportune time to be talking about inequality together. So what does inequality do to us? And here, I'm sorry, let me get my props real quickly. I'm drawing on work from Wilkinson and Pickett, and this would be Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, two public health doctors, epidemiologists in Britain, who've written two books in the last decade. The first, oh, that's kind of washed out, isn't it? There we go, The Spirit Level. And the second, the more recent publication, The Inner Level. And what they show, and this is really just a very brief summary of the central finding of their work, is that when you take an overall index of health and social problems, which includes life expectancy, math, literacy, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teenage birth, trust, obesity, mental illness, and social mobility. So please note that although Wilkinson and Pickett are public health doctors, what they're looking at is not exclusively public health. They're looking at overall social welfare, you might refer to it. And what they find is that in a more equal society, you have fewer of these problems altogether. And in a more unequal society, you have more of these problems, right? So Japan, Sweden, Norway, at the time this data was collected, were among the most equal societies. Note that the data is about 10 years old, and so some things may have changed in the ranking of inequality here. And then the US, Portugal, the United Kingdom were the most unequal societies and also had the highest incidence of these social problems. I'm going to just spend a moment thinking about life expectancy as one dimension of this index of social inequality, and point out to you that if you compare the United States with every other developed country in the world, with the possible exception of Saudi Arabia, we have both tremendous wealth, right? GDP is very high, and not nearly as high a life expectancy as really almost every other society that we would compare ourselves to. And in the class, we looked at what's really driving the fact that the United States is lagging and that life expectancy in the United States is actually decreasing at a moment when it's increasing in almost all these other societies. And what seems to be driving it is what a pair of economists, Ann Case and Angus Deaton, labeled deaths of despair. And these are suicides and drug overdoses and disease and death related to alcoholism. And what we see is that in America, whites with less than a college degree are rapidly increasing in the category of deaths of despair. African Americans with less than a college degree are increasing, though not as rapidly. Whites and African Americans with a college degree, not increasing at all. So it's really what's happened to the working class in the United States that seems to be driving down life expectancy. The fact that they've gone from, especially white working class people, from being economically secure to being economically precarious, from feeling and in a sense having it sanctioned by their wages and the kind of work that they had, that they were fully equal, dignified members of our society, to perceiving accurately that they're becoming more and more disposable, less and less valuable. And this is driving them to despair and ultimately to drugs and alcohol and suicide. So just to be clear, I don't mean to minimalize this. We've been talking about it for a long time. There's a deep human cost to rising inequality in the United States. It is affecting us in multiple profound ways. The deepest, saddest aspect of this is deaths of despair, but the fact that children are being bullied, the fact that obesity is increasing, the fact that we have such a high rate of our population incarcerated, all of this, Wilkinson and Pickett and many others suggest, can ultimately be traced back to the increase in inequality. And Wilkinson and Pickett suggest this diagram to begin to help us to explain why this is occurring. And there are two dimensions to the why question. One dimension is why we are becoming more unequal. And let me just see, I tried to summarize this, and I know I'm moving fast, and I do want to be fair both to the new people joining the course and to the people who've already been along for quite a while, and I'm trying to balance those two. So one thing that we concluded from our study of the sociology of equality and inequality is that when a society is reasonably equal, right, starts out as quite equal, it gives rise to an expectation on the part of its members. They expect to be treated as equals. They therefore vote for policies that preserve their equality. However, there are typically dynamics that threaten inequality, even in an equal society. Racism and sexism would be clear threats. Unequal access to education would be another threat. Unequal returns on capital and wages would be still another threat, right? Which is to say, if the people who invest for a living constantly get a higher return on their investment than the people who work for a living get increases in their wages, that's going to open inequality between them over time, right? And so unless you do something to counteract that, right? And so here we get the idea of equalizing reform, that living in a society that protects the equality of its citizens and its members is not a once and for all accomplishment. It's a constant dynamic of determining where the threats to equality come from, given changes in the economy and changes in the society, whether in our recent past, that is deindustrialization, a move away from an economy in which manufacturing is the dominant form of work, to an economy in which service work is the dominant form of work. And the fact that that presents different kinds of challenges. It's harder to sustain unions in a service sector economy. It's also the case that service sector jobs have greater wage stretching, and so that there's more inequality in them, and so more needs to be done to prop up the minimum wage and to encourage a fair distribution of income, either through wage policy or through taxation, right? And the other, let me stop there in terms of illustrating this, but when we have big changes like that, we need to evolve our policy to have countervailing instruments ready to hand. As inequality builds up, we need, for instance, pro-union policy, educational opportunity to be equalized, and affirmative action programs if there is racism and sexism in our society. And if we do that, perhaps we can secure an equalizing circle. In the United States, over the last 50, 60, 70 years, we have clearly failed to do this. We have, due to globalization, seen wages go down for most workers. Due to this transition from an industrial to a post-industrial economy, we've seen unionization go way down. With automation, the number of skilled jobs in our economy have gone way down. The tax system has become much less progressive or redistributive. And so we could keep going, but in many respects, our economy has become more unequal, and the instruments of public policy that we used to use to counteract inequality have fallen out of step with the nature of the forces producing greater equality. The result of all this is that we've moved from being the squat pyramid to being the tall pyramid, right? And so this is now going back to Wilkinson and Pickett. And what they point out is that in both of these societies, the one that is more equal and the one that is less equal, you have what sociologists and economists call strata. You have levels, right? You have the bottom group, the middle group, and the top group. But in the society that is more equal, the distance between those groups is less, and so which group you belong to matters less. Whereas in this pyramid, the difference between the bottom and the middle is essentially the same as the difference between the bottom and the top in the squat pyramid. And certainly the difference between the top and the bottom is of an altogether different kind than you get in a more equal society. And so in a more unequal society, people are more attuned to the inequality, to the differences between them. And in particular, they do more to try to show that they belong to an upper strata, an upper rung on the social ladder. They spend more money on status markers, whether that's where they live or the kind of car they drive, the kind of clothes they wear, the way they fix their teeth or their hair or their face, the kind of vacation they take. They consider it. We consider it because, of course, we are this very unequal society. We consider it more important because it matters more, right? If you're in one of these upper strata in the unequal society, all kinds of opportunities are available to you that are not available in the lower strata. And the result of all of this is that we spend more time worrying about what other people are thinking about us. And I've put that in a very commonsensical way, but I need to refine it a little bit. What I should really say is that social evaluative threat is more prevalent in a more unequal society. And what that means is that implicitly, unconsciously, as well as explicitly and consciously, we are constantly aware of being evaluated in our society, of people paying attention to the status differences between us. And the result is that we are stressed. We are constantly feeling the pressure of social evaluation. It turns out we have preserved that animal portion of our brain that pays a lot of attention to status hierarchy. And that when we have that stress, it is bad for us. It's okay to experience stress intermittently, occasionally, but when it's constant, as social evaluative stress is in an unequal society, it leads to health and psychological problems. And so the fact that we've become a more unequal society is bad for us. All right, so that was a little bit of a review of a lot of material. I'm sorry I went through it so quickly. I didn't want to jump right in the middle of a topic where we've got new people joining us. And I hope that for those of you who've been along, maybe it's not a bad exercise to review our tracks and see where we've come. Now, in the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at normative issues, issues not in sociology and economics and psychology. Those are empirical issues. How do we understand how we've become so unequal and what it's doing to us? The new issues that we've been discussing together for the last few weeks have to do not with that, but with why it's objectionable, right? And you might say, well, it's unhealthy. Clearly it's objectionable. Everybody wants to be healthy. But we have, I think, a stronger intuition than that. It's not just that it's unhealthy. I think many of us believe, and I'm certainly one among them, that it is unjust, unfair, that our society has become so much more unequal. And in particular, that it is a violation of the most important moral and political commitment that our society makes. And that commitment, as we talked about last week when we met together on the 4th of July, is clearly expressed in the Declaration of Independence and in its assertion that it is self-evidently true that all men are created equal, and that gives rise to their possession of equal and inalienable rights, and that includes the right to consent to the way in which they are governed. And if they cannot consent, to change government, to change policy, or to rise up in order to do something if the policy cannot be changed, right? And we looked together at multiple iterations of the Declaration of Independence, how Jefferson's original draft was revised, how Frederick Douglass appropriated the language of the Declaration in an abolitionist speech on July 4th in 1852, how Abraham Lincoln hearkened back to the Declaration in trying to chart a new course for America as it emerged from the Civil War. And so this is clearly a proposition that we are all equal that is particularly resonant for Americans and in American history. We looked together at a book by Jeremy Waldron that helps us to see the foundation for Jefferson's proposition that all men are created equal. The book is called One Another's Equals, the Basis of Human Equality. And he works in this book to defend this intuition. Dignity, I believe, is best understood as a status term. It refers to the standing of human beings in the great scheme of things. Their status as persons who command a high level of concern and respect. The basis of our equal dignity as human is supposed to be something fundamental about us that makes it important for us to accord equal moral consideration to one another and to respect each other in the same way. Right? So he calls that basic equality. This is not, what kind of tax policy does equality require? What kind of education system? What kind of labor law? This is why do we say that we are equal? Can we make the moral argument as explicit as possible? And Waldron does that by pointing to what he calls range properties. And for those of you who are just joining this lecture series, I'll do my best to review this in a way that makes sense to you. The core claim here is that you cannot defend human equality in a way that is insensitive to obvious differences. You can run faster and sing better and dance with better rhythm than I can. There's just no doubt about it, right? And on the other hand, maybe my understanding of political science and political philosophy is better than yours, right? And so there are differences between us, and there are differences that open up particular dimensions of inequality between us. We're not all the same. We are diverse, and that diversity includes different capacities, capabilities, skills, and talents, right? And no egalitarian should try to deny that, because it is undeniable. And frankly, that diversity is part of what we value about the world, right? And I come to hear you sing and enjoy watching you dance because you're better at it than I am, right? If you came to see me do that stuff, you would be sorely disappointed. So what Waldron points to is what he calls range properties. And these are properties that all human beings have, but they have to varying degrees, right? So all of us have the capacity to feel affection for others. Some of us might be what you would call empathic savants. You immediately understand that somebody is upset. And others of us might be what you would call emotional morons, right? The person has to come out and scream it at us before we understand, oh, you're upset, why didn't you say something, right? And so on the one hand, clearly there's a range in the way in which we experience emotion, our emotional intelligence. And on the other hand, every human being who isn't pathological or substantially impaired feels affection for other human beings, loves their parents, loves their spouse or their partner and their children, right? Values friendship and their friends. And so what Waldron suggests is it's enough that you have the minimum degree of that to be counted as an equal. And the same thing goes for the capacity for reason, the capacity in particular for moral reasoning, for leading your life by your own lights, making your own decisions, being an autonomous person. All of these things are, when present at all, a reason for treating persons as moral equals, for showing them equal concern and respect. Because if I treat you like a piece of furniture as opposed to someone with feelings, right, I will injure you. If I treat you like a piece of furniture and do with you what I want to do, as opposed to recognizing that you have reason and goals and ends and pursuits, I will offend you. I will fail to respect your capacity for reasoning and figuring out what matters to you, right? And so Waldron suggests we don't need to be hostile to diversity in order to defend equality. There's a solid defense for equality. And as Tim Scanlon, whose work we're about to turn to, this book, I'm sorry, again, the light is making it very difficult to see the title, but Why Does Inequality Matter by T.M. Scanlon. There we go. If I get it close enough, it shows up, right? He suggests that recognizing fundamental human equality is the single most important dimension of human moral progress in the last 100 years, and perhaps in all of human history. And so Waldron helps us to see, in a sense, that Jefferson's bold declaration, all men are created equal, is not just a piece of political rhetoric. It's an intuition that we can set a very strong moral and philosophical foundation underneath. And so this is then where we left off, right? Thinking about the Declaration and the moral grounding for the intuition that the Declaration contains. And today, with the remaining time, having reviewed some of what we've covered together, I just want to point out a couple complications from Waldron's work and then move into new work. And so one complication, and again, this doesn't, I think, in any way undermine the strength of the case that Waldron and others are making for fundamental human equality. It just alerts us to some of the more tricky issues once we've accepted this case. One of those is the degree to which we can afford equal concern and respect to each other without knowing a lot about each other. Are we respecting what George Herbert Mead called the general other, the person who I just interact with and know you're the everyman or every person of our society? Or do we only fully show respect and recognition for someone as an equal when we get to know them as a particular other, to understand their specific identity? And we can take examples here. For instance, if I have views about the importance of affection, and I start talking to you and your views are different from mine, do I need to take that into account? If it turns out, well, maybe I don't attach as much value to affection because I'm male. And in this society, that side of me is typically not as well developed. And you are female and you've done a lot of care work in your life. You've raised children and cared for husbands, perhaps cared for parents when they were infirm, perhaps worked in a caring profession. Maybe I need to understand that about you to be able to show you full equality. And so is it that we just know that people have the capacity for affection and therefore we should show them equal concern and respect? Or do we need to understand something more specific about others to fully value them as equals? Similarly, and I pointed out to you a couple weeks ago that Jeremy Waldron started his decade-long project of thinking about the nature of the idea of equality, its defensibility within moral philosophy, by looking at the work of John Locke, the person who, in a sense, generates the tradition that our constitutional law comes from, and that Locke would not separate, completely entwined, a theological and a secular philosophical argument. Right, and what Waldron points out is that we've stopped doing that. We've translated the theological into constitutional, legal, and moral discourse, and we've stopped talking about God because not all of us believe in God. And if we do believe in God, we don't all believe in the same religious tradition, right? And so we can't really convince each other in the way that Locke could assume that his audience was all Christian, right? It just doesn't work that well anymore. But have we lost something when we say, right, that we're all equal because we all feel affection, we all have reason, we all have the capacity for moral autonomy, but don't say, and God made us all in his image and made us all equally his children? Have we lost some richness? Have we lost some power? Are we perhaps less effective egalitarians? All right, so that takes me to the end of the first half of the lecture, and I do want to stop for a moment to see if there are questions or comments or concerns. So does anybody want to come in to the conversation at this moment? And I am going to now unmute everyone. So just beware, if you've got any noise in the background, it may get picked up by the microphone. And if you want to speak, now I've unmuted you. You may also have to unmute yourself, although it looks like most of you are unmuted. Anybody want to start us out? I'm particularly eager to hear from the people who were not along for this lecture series so far. The people at Grand Lake Gardens, Grand Lake Gardens. You know, for what it's worth, I grew up in and around Grand Lake. And so I should be able to say that. Sorry that I keep making a mistake. But anyway, if any of the people from Grand Lake Gardens have a question, please let me know.
David,
Yes.
this is Joan. I just want to say how much I appreciate your summary. I did not expect that, and it was masterful.
Thank you, Joan. I will take the compliment. Thank you. I do my best to make this accessible to everyone. And like I say, I'm just glad to have new people along and to make this more inclusive. Anyone else? All right, well, please feel free. And by the way, I believe you know that if you ever want to unmute yourself, all you do is you hold down your space bar and then you can start speaking. You don't have to wait for me, but I will pause intermittently for comments. But let me get back into what I was sharing with you because we do have territory still to cover. And in particular, I now want to start discussing T.M. Scanlon's recent work, Why Does Inequality Matter? And this is something that some of you may recollect. I discussed with you maybe a year ago. It's an important and influential book by one of the most important moral and political philosophers alive today. And I'll just be very brief in introducing him. T.M. Scanlon is now an emeritus professor of philosophy at Harvard University. And in, I believe, 1999, he published What We Owe to Each Other, which was one of the most anticipated and most influential works of moral and political philosophy published in the last quarter century. And in this book, he stakes out a position that he calls contractualism. And to be clear, what he says is when we think about what morality is, right? That's the big fundamental question, and that's why his work is so significant. He's trying to answer perhaps the most important question in moral philosophy: what is morality? Not what makes somebody moral or immoral, though he does have a lot to say about that as well, but where does morality come from? What makes certain claims moral? He suggests that morality is best understood not as existing independently from us, out there in the universe, in the way, say, that the laws of physics are, but instead as constructed by us. We make it through our reasoning. And in particular, what morality does is try to give us principles to govern our interaction with each other, right? If I'm just sitting here in my own room deciding what book I want to read, frankly, it's none of your business. I get to do that the way I want to do it, right? But if I want to come into your room and take a book off of your shelf and read it, I have to ask your permission. Why? Well, because it's yours, and because I would have to invade your space and take one of your possessions. And we all agree, right, that that is something that I can only do if you give me permission to do, right? But where does that norm come from? Scanlon suggests that when we affect each other significantly, we owe each other reasons. What we owe to each other is a justification for our conduct when we affect each other. And in providing those reasons and those justifications, we end up constructing principles. And when those principles come to be widely endorsed as the right answer to the question, we come to regard them as moral principles, right? So we make morality by reasoning with each other about how we should treat each other. That may sound very commonsensical, but in a sense, Scanlon in this book, and it's a important, densely reasoned, long tome of the, I have it on my bookcase without the fancy cover. Do I have it on my bookcase? Oh goodness, I must have it. No, I do. So I'm sorry. I don't. I have the original hardback, not the softback, but it's 400 pages of densely argued philosophical analysis to establish that. Now, Scanlon has not written a lot. He's not a fast writer. He's a very precise writer, but he does have this other book, The Difficulty of Tolerance, and then this just recently published book, a little bit more than a year ago, Why Does Inequality Matter? And it's that book that I want to concentrate on in the context of a lecture series on rising inequality. But before I do that, let me start with Scanlon's central principle, right? This is the principle of his contractualist way of thinking. It's on page, I guess the book was published in 1998, not 1999. Page 153 of What We Owe to Each Other reads, an act is wrong if its performance under the circumstances would be disallowed by any set of principles for the general regulation of behavior that no one could reasonably reject as a basis for informed, unforced, general agreement. Now, Scanlon is kind of almost a lawyerly philosopher, right? Each word, each phrase is doing work in this principle, right? Despite the fact that they're all relatively common words, their combined import is precise and demanding. The thing I want to focus on is this idea of reasonable rejection, right? In order for me to be able to say that what I'm doing to you is right, when I take a book off my own shelf, that's something I'm reasonably allowed to do. Well, how did I get those books? Did I steal them from the library? Then maybe it's not such a permissible thing to do if we could not reasonably reject principles that say you can't steal from the library or you can't steal, right? And so what this idea of reasonable rejection as the fulcrum on which moral judgment rests does is to emphasize consent, right? Each of us has the capacity to reason for ourselves, and on that basis to determine whether or not these are principles that, when I understand how they work and all the relevant background information, when I am truly free to reject them, they're unforced. And when everybody else is engaged in the project of trying to find principles, they don't just apply to you but not to me, or vice versa, they apply to all of us, then I can't reject them, right? That I don't have any good argument. I'm just being selfish or self-serving. And so please note that in a sense, what Scanlon is paying attention to is this capacity for reason and moral reasoning in particular. What we do when we look for arguments that nobody can reasonably reject is pay attention to the fact that each of us has the capacity to think for ourselves, and therefore shouldn't be treated like furniture or an object, but instead should be treated like a person, and their consent should be sought. So that's the core, the central plank of Scanlon's moral philosophy. And this then leads him really at the end of his career. As I said, he's an emeritus professor at Harvard. And this book, Why Does Inequality Matter, was the book that he decided to write right as he was retiring from Harvard. And I don't know, we'll have to see. Given the pace at which he writes, I fear it may be his last book. Why did he focus on this question? And here I think he indicates that there's a puzzle, an intellectual puzzle, which is, why should we be concerned about inequality per se? And I'll give you an example that I hope brings this into focus. Let's say we live in a society where everyone is a millionaire, where $1 million is still a lot of money and worth a lot. But some few people, let's call it the top 1%, are billionaires, right? And so everybody has enough. Everybody has sufficient money and wealth to have a decent or better than decent standard of living. But some people have a lot more. If I object to them having a lot more when I have enough, am I just being mean-spirited, little resentful? Or is there a moral reason for me, even if I have plenty, to say I reject somebody having 1,000 times more than I do? And so Scanlon thinks that really that's a puzzle that philosophy hadn't thought through carefully, and he wants to think it through, and he comes to the conclusion that there are reasons to object to inequality that are independent from the fact that typically those who are least well off are also miserable or vulnerable or precarious as a result. Even if that isn't the consequence of inequality, inequality is still objectionable. And in then seeking the answer to this question, he finds it in what I'm going to call, this is my language, a moral anatomy of the reasons to care about being equal and unequal, and how that reveals the structure of justification. And so if you take the example I've just given, everybody's a millionaire, but a few people are billionaires. If we still have reasons to object at that point, what we are objecting to precisely is inequality, not vulnerability, immiseration, etc., right? And so on what grounds are we objecting to the inequality itself, as opposed to its consequences? And here Scanlon suggests there are two main categories of reasons that lead us to find inequality per se objectionable. One category is relation, right? When you have $1 billion, even though I have $1 million, even though I'm doing fine, you can do things I can't do. For instance, if my child, sorry, let me be singular about this, is a very gifted violinist, you may still be able to bribe the music school to admit your child and not my child, right? Or let's not call it a bribe. Let's say you give a large gift to the music school, and out of gratitude, they really can't resist admitting your child, right? This has generated a relationship between us that is not fair, because your wealth, the fact that you are so much richer than I am, gives you power that I don't have. And that is unfair. That's one kind of reason we have for rejecting inequality per se. The second kind of reason has to do with the institutions that generate inequality. How did you get your $1 billion? And is it fair that institutions that are supposed to treat us as equals have somehow allowed you to get so much more than I have? Is it compatible with institutions showing equal concern and respect for everyone that they somehow generate this level of inequality? And that's a second independent set of reasons. So now let me get into this in greater detail. And as I say, he offers an anatomy of these reasons, a kind of scaffolding. And I think it's one of the reasons this book is so valuable. If you're an egalitarian, if you care about equality, here are the lists of reasons you should be able to employ in an argument with someone who is less egalitarian or less impressed with the importance of equality than you are. And so I'm going to start with one category of reasons that has 4 different sets of reasons within it. These are reasons stemming from the effects of inequality. And so inequality typically gives rise to status differences. And we go back to that stretched out pyramid, the steep pyramid, and compare it with the squat pyramid, right? When we get more unequal, it's easier for us to mark our differences, to dress differently, drive different vehicles, live in different neighborhoods, take different vacations. And the way human psychology works, typically that results in us thinking of some people as having a higher status and standing, as being in some way superior, right? And being therefore people that we'd rather be friends with, or have a relationship with, or have working for us, or have leading us, right? And what Scanlon says is, when inequality becomes sufficiently advanced that it generates status differences of those kinds, then some people are going to be excluded from what he calls a range of social goods and relations. The goods might include getting the plum job, where getting the plum job is not just about getting the most pay, but having the most meaningful work. If you really want to be a surgeon because you have the dexterity and the understanding of physiology and biology required, and you really want to intervene in people's lives in a way that helps you to restore their health, and yet you're excluded from that because your parents couldn't afford to send you to the right school, you have been harmed, right? Even if you turn out to have a perfectly good career in some other field, you were excluded from what you wanted to do for no good reason other than that you or your parents lacked the resources to make the investment necessary to open that path to you. That, Scanlon says, is intrinsically a good objection to inequality. Similarly, in this kind of unequal society, part of what we see is that people seek out those who are high status. They want to be friends with them. Whereas people who don't dress well, don't go to the right restaurants or museums or plays, don't drive the right kind of vehicle are often overlooked, not given the same opportunity to meet people, have friends, have relationships. And again, that's a kind of exclusion that Scanlon suggests is intrinsically objectionable. Second kind of objection is that you lack control over your own life once inequality gets to be so extreme. If there are billionaires, even if I'm a millionaire, the billionaire can influence people in ways that I can't, and can influence them to do things for them or to me that affect my life dramatically, right? The kind of school I can go to, the kind of career I can have, the kind of neighborhood I can have, the kinds of friends I can have are now being manipulated by somebody else, when we should all have the equal capacity to influence those central aspects of our life. Third, equality of opportunity, or to put it in the negative, the idea that some people who are already advantaged will monopolize positions of advantage for themselves and their descendants and their friends and people like them, right? And again, this is intrinsically objectionable because everybody should have the opportunity to get a fair share to compete for, a fair chance to compete for the goods that our society creates. Finally, political fairness, that it's impossible once inequality becomes too extensive for everybody to have an equal opportunity to influence political decision-making, especially the law. All right, so I know, I believe, let me be sure, yes, I've now exactly come up against my time limit, and I've thrown a fair bit at you. Let me stop presenting Scanlon. I'm not all the way there, but I think you've got enough information to have a feel for his approach, and I imagine you must have some questions. Somebody, David, is saying, honest discussion about whether stuff is generally accepted. How would you frame the current debate over mask wearing? Yeah, okay. So yeah, I want to say, in a sense, it's an easy question, even if it's a thorny policy and social issue. And part of this is just framing it correctly. There was a editorial in the New York Times, I can't remember who wrote it, that basically said that not wearing a mask is like driving drunk, right? That the reason we wear masks now is not to protect ourselves. It's not some sign of masculinity, toughness, bravery, robustness. My immune system is so strong, I'm not gonna wear a friggin' mask, right? It's a sign of concern for others. We live in a world in which we can have a virus that can kill other people that may not even be detectable in us, right, as we go about our business. If I wear a mask, it makes it a lot less likely that I am going to transmit the virus to somebody who may be vulnerable, who may really suffer dire health consequences as a result. And so I want to be clear, right, about how this connects to Scanlon. Scanlon says, ultimately, when what we do affects each other significantly, we need to be able to justify it to others. And so let's put ourselves in the position. I'm physically resilient. I'm not worried about the virus, but I may have it. I could transmit it to you. Is my desire to have my airways unimpeded, to be able to show you my nice smile when I smile at you, to express my masculinity and my vitality, more important than your interest in not contracting a deadly virus? Can I justify to you as a general principle for the regulation of conduct that when I don't want to, I don't need to do things that protect you, when my conduct would be significantly threatening to you, and the measure I am being asked to take is a relatively minor incursion on my liberty? Then I think it's quite clear, just like nobody has a right to drive drunk. And frankly, you don't really have a right not to wear a safety belt, not because we don't want you to be in a deadly accident. Hopefully we don't want you to be, but because frankly, if you don't wear your safety belt and do get in a terrible accident, are then going to put a burden on the healthcare system, right? And so there are a number of illustrations of measures that we take that are ordinary, call them paternalistic measures to protect ourselves from you or ourselves from each other, that are almost always justified on these grounds. Now, what's going on with debate over the masks then, if it's such an obvious, clear-cut case? And I would say to you, quite simply, that it's become a culture war issue, right? And that unfortunately, in America today, a lot of resentment against inequality, the way in which our economy and society have transformed, the fact that coastal elites mainly are doing so much better than most everyone else, has been expressed as resentment against expertise, and that this is just the most recent illustration of that. John Eastman says, I don't believe that everybody should get a Nobel Prize. John, do you think you should? Joking. Let me, I don't believe that everyone should. I certainly don't believe that I should. And I even am fine with the Nobel Prize winners having special parking places at UC Berkeley, which they do, as many of you know. To be clear, yes, so equality does not mean leveling. What I wouldn't like would be a society in which people who won Nobel Prizes got 2 votes, right? Or didn't have to wear masks, but the rest of us did, right? In which the fact that they are obviously capable of solving problems, thinking thoughts, creating literature that the rest of us can't do and couldn't dream of doing, needs to be acknowledged. And when they have developed their talents and their capacities, their intrinsic abilities in a way that allows them to be valuable to all of us, right? Then why shouldn't we honor them differentially? I don't think there's anything wrong with that. That's not what Scanlon or Waldron or other egalitarians are objecting to. What they're objecting to would be a society in which if you got a Nobel Prize, you also got multiple votes, or you were allowed to keep the billions of dollars your invention made you without any taxation to address the inequality, especially if it continues across generations. You can give it all to your children as well. It's the social effects of our different realized abilities, not the different realized abilities themselves that egalitarians object to. I hope that helps, John. And let me be sure, I'm now unmuting everyone, so I took the couple written questions I had. Anybody want to ask a question over the airwaves? Go ahead. Who wants to start us out? Anybody there? Yes, I'm hearing some sound now. I guess you're able to speak. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay, this is Matt. And
Hi, Matt. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm going to say a few good words in favor of differential accumulation of wealth up to a point. I mean, this is really what makes the capitalist system so productive, not just for the people who get terribly, terribly rich, but also for everybody. The real trick is to figure out how to readjust things. And that's why it seems to me that the real solution here is not to try to clip the wings of the people who are in fact accumulating great wealth, because, you know, some of them steal it, but an awful lot of them sort of in some weird way earn it. And if you then say you can have it for life, but when you go, you can just, you know, maybe take care of your children at a subsistence level, and the rest of it goes to society. You solve the inequality problem, but you don't take away the incentive that is the essential part of a successful capitalist system.
And I don't disagree with you, Matt. And I think, frankly, even if we had a socialist system, we would still want economic incentives. And so let's take an example, right? And I've spoken a little bit about being a surgeon already, right? So let's assume that to be an effective surgeon, you have to undergo a lot of training, right? You need to, in your undergraduate years, do an awful lot of hard chemistry, biology, physiology, while other people are out having fun or studying literature, which might have made you happier, right? And then you have to go to medical school, and we know what long hours that is, and then internship and residency, right? And so you sacrifice a decade of your life to doing the preparatory work, and that sacrifice should be compensated. And frankly, what we want is a society where the people who can master all the skills to be an effective, good, maybe even innovative surgeon to solve some problems that haven't been solved before, go into that career. And part of the way we can get them to go into that career and make the sacrifices is to give them an incentive, right? And so again, I don't think you have to believe that everybody should earn the same, no matter what they do, right? That's not the egalitarian argument. That's a leveling down argument, at least in the way that I understand it. And neither Waldron nor Scanlon endorses that argument. But what we need to understand is how much inequality in wages, salary, earning, wealth is compatible with living in a society in which we are all treated as moral and political equals. And we can hope, and I believe it's a hope that is borne out, that the level of equality, the range, the bounded range of inequality required by political and moral equality is compatible with economic incentives. It's enough for you to earn 40 times what I earn because you're an innovator and an inventor or really good at what you do and it's really valuable to us. You don't have to earn 400 times what I earn, right? And part of what we see when we look back at the data on the United States is that in the 1950s and the 1960s, when CEOs were earning about 20 to 30 times as much as average workers, we were a very productive economy. And today, when CEOs are earning 300 to 400 times as much as their employees, we are in fact a less productive economy. So at some point, the incentives are no longer necessary to economic productivity and no longer compatible with moral and political equality. The trick, the challenge is to identify that range of inequality that capitalism or economic incentives require and that morality and equal citizenship permit. Yeah, so thank you, Matt. That is a good point and one that helps to clarify the underlying stakes. Do you want to follow up on that at all?
Let me
I'm not hearing you now, Matt. Are you there?
Yeah, okay, I think I'm now unmuted.
Okay, good.
Yeah, you know, I think that the problem of excessive CEO salaries is a significant and serious part of our economic organization today. But I think probably a lot of that has to do with the loss of control of the management of corporations by the owners, the shareholders.
Yeah.
Everybody now owns stock through a mutual fund. The mutual fund doesn't mess around with picking the CEO or complaining that they're paying them too much. You ought to be able to get a pretty good CEO for 50 times what you're paying the worker. But somehow or other, this whole thing's gotten out of hand. And there may be another solution to that problem that's different from trying to figure out a way to cap the amount that you pay somebody. That's a real problem. When you begin to get regulation of almost anything, it tends to sort of put the sand in the gears of the capitalist system.
Yeah, so I agreed with you up until the last little bit that you said. And so just drilling down on CEO compensation for a moment, I think you're right to point to mutual funds, but I think there are other things that we should point to as well. Investor value, the investor understanding, right? And so in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, investors were more concerned with long-term returns. Beginning in the 80s, they became more concerned with short-term returns, and that shifted the culture. But I would point out also that the composition of corporate boards, right, and the fact that many people on boards are themselves CEOs, and they recognize if they vote for a higher salary for the CEO of this corporation, then when their board meets, that board is equally likely to approve a higher salary for them. So I was with you on all of that until you said regulation throws sand in the gears of capitalism. And I just can't agree with that. I mean, we'd have to have a much more detailed conversation about which kinds of regulation throws sand. I'm going to mute for a moment because we're getting some feedback. But does occupational health and safety regulation throw sand in the gears of capitalism? Or is it necessary to have a humane working place? And does it turn out that, in fact, you can have a humane working place and capitalism can be perfectly productive? Does environmental regulation prevent?
Oh, hey, David.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have no disagreement with that at all. I'm just saying that if you try to figure out a way to tell corporations how much they can pay their CEO, I think that's a slippery slope. All of it, we're short on regulation on many other areas, health, safety, all that stuff.
And what Germany does and some other societies do is they, in their corporate law, put workers on the board and consumers on the board, so that the board does not only represent shareholders, but represents what they call broadly stakeholders, right? And that seems to me to be a less invasive form of regulation. So I completely agree with you. There are bad regulations that do gum up the works. But again, I think there's a way of addressing the problem of CEO compensation. Let me just make things a little harder for me for a second and talk about compensation for innovators, right? Do we want Steve Jobs, et cetera, to be able to make the billions he makes so that he creates these fabulous products for us? That's where we start to get a little trickier. It's interesting to note that many of the true titans of Silicon Valley or computer innovation say they would have done what they did for hundreds of billions. They didn't need tens of billions to do it. And so again, I think when we're thinking about incentives, we have to be honest, but we have to be nuanced. Incentives matter, but that doesn't mean that the incentives have to be so massive that they interfere with moral or political equality. That at least is the circle that egalitarians are trying to square. Thank you, Matt. Anybody else have a question or a thought or a comment? All right, well, we've been at it a nice long time today. I had a lot of fun. Welcome again to the new people. And we will continue this discussion next week. Please note that we are beginning to get to the point where we will start looking at policy solutions. All right, everybody. Take care. Have good weeks. Keep being safe and smart, and take care. I will see you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, David.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.